Hello everyone, my name is Rochelle Innocent and I'm the founder and CEO of Project Purpose. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Our community is focused on fostering the intellectual and character development in children. We do this through our parent-child workshops that focus on 4 themes: autonomy, self-efficacy, compassion, and self-concept, in order to cultivate grit, perseverance, and resilience in each child. At Project Purpose, our overarching mandate is to renew and rebuild family, communities, and relationships. Our YouTube platform provides us with an opportunity to have discussions on all topics that relate to family, communities, and relationships with ourselves as well as with others, with a primary focus on mental health and education. More precisely, the ways that the institutions of mental health and education play a role and have played a role in our societies at large. These discussions and debates provide us with a chance to think critically about what needs to change within these structures in order for us to live up to our bold slogan: support, protect, and empower each child through youth-focused development, better known as leadership in juvenescence. We recognize that in order for our children to thrive, that also translates as recreating and co-creating environments both socially and politically. Now, for those of you who are particularly keen on our topic, definitely be sure to check out our website. I've provided the description right here under my finger. Check us out. We write thought pieces every other Sunday, and we actually just dropped a thought piece this past Sunday. So definitely be sure to give that a read and subscribe to the website. Now, as is the YouTube convention, please do subscribe. Hit that post notification bell so that you're aware of every time we post. And of course, if you like our content and you want to keep these conversations going, and I sure do hope so that you do, then be sure to like, comment, and share this video. Let's get into it. Hello everyone and welcome back. And this is video 2 this week on education. And this week we're drilling down, and it's a little bit of a deeper critique by way of how mental health shows up within a classroom and why we should be skeptical about the way that mental health is addressed and identified within a classroom setting. I'm definitely happy to be having this conversation with you, and I'd like to preface these conversations, especially when I get, political, but these are my personal opinions. These are my views, these are my objectives. I'm definitely going to be providing resources and research down below so that you see that my views and my objectives are both informed, and I've spent a lot of time, doing research to validify, I guess, my own position. I think this has been my position for a while, but then I've read the research on both sides. So while I am biased, I definitely have the information that, someone who would take a counter position might offer. And I still feel very strongly about, the things that I talk about on this channel by way of education and how that translates in the ways that I like to see it reformed. But talk about and debate. I'm here to have a conversation. I'm here to have engagement, and I want to hear your perspective as well. I don't think that change happens because one person puts their foot on the, like stamps their foot in the ground and forces everyone their way. I think it happens when we deliberate and we have different conversations and we are focused on building something that is a reflection of the collective voice and of what we all believe would be the better environment for our children and for future generations to come. And I think regardless of where you stand by way of how education translates now, all of us can see that there are areas that require improvement. And me, I'm focusing specifically on the way that mental health translates within the classroom setting and how that needs to change. So I think we're going to just jump right into sort of the critique. And this is a specific critique and a criticism on the way that educators inject themselves into a parent's decision making around whether or not their child has a mental health issue. And this is something that is very close to my heart. It's something that I'm very passionate about specifically because a lot of children are misdiagnosed with mental health issues each year. A lot of children are provided with prescription medication that they should have never been provided with year over year over year. And I'm going to provide some metrics down below. But this is an issue, and we have a lot of teachers dealing with their own mental health issues, with dealing with the stress that comes with being an educator. But then for me as a child advocate, and as someone who is an HR professional, if the stress is insurmountable, if you're in a role where you find that you struggle to manage the stress that comes with that role, that comes with the job activities that are detailed within that role, that typically means there's a lack of fit. A strong fit between yourself and a specific profession involves your ability to thrive in that position, to manage the stress that comes with that position, the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, the ambiguity that comes with that position. And when you are in a position as impactful as teaching, that it's important that all of us become much more in tune to whether or not a teacher has the capacity to perform in their role, because their mental health will reflect in our students, their mental health will be projected on our students, which are also our children, our nieces or nephews, what have you. And we want to make sure that it's a healthy climate, a healthy environment for everyone, especially for the children who are growing and developing within that space. So my issue is the idea that an educator identify a child with having a mental health issue that later then is forced on medication. So we all know that there are educational environments that will dictate that if a child is not put on medication, that they are not allowed to come back to school, which puts a parent between a rock and a hard place, because obviously they want their child to be educated. And I think that this practice needs to absolutely stop. I'm completely vehemently against this practice of peer pressuring parents into medicating their children so that teachers have an easier go at educating their classroom. I don't think that teaching was ever meant to be an easy role. I don't think, though, that the solution is to make it easier by sedating children who are otherwise healthy and simply active. That's not a solution, and it's a solution that has become far too prevalent in the last few decades. So what's my specific criticism of this? Like, what's my specific caution, like note of caution in relation to allowing yourself to be peer pressured by an educator or by a student or by a school administration to put your children on prescription medication? Well, the first one is be very apprehensive when it comes to observer relative biases of both the clinician and your educator. It doesn't matter how often someone sees certain behaviors manifest. All of us are individuals. All of our levels of activity, hyperactivity are very different. These are all very relative. There is no human being that represents like the ideal. That is something that is socially constructed. So regardless of how many years someone has sort of in the field, if anything that reinforces their bias and reinforces sort of the habit of just simply writing the prescription and writing children off without paying specific attention to each specific child. I mentioned in earlier videos, mental health is a soft science, it's not a hard science. So in order to identify someone as being mentally unwell, it's more than just measuring their behavior against a benchmark, is measuring their behavior against their own personal benchmark. So how much is this specific behavior a deviation from how they typically behave? And when we're talking about behavior just generally, we need to recognize that this benchmark sort of ideology where everyone is sort of lumped together with the majority, it needs to end, because it's not true. It's not true. All benchmarks are sums of averages. All averages are built off of individual dispositions, and none of those dispositions are abnormal simply because they're deviations from the norm, which is like where majority of people show up. We need more than that to qualify a behavior as abnormal, to qualify a behavior as a mental health issue, and to disorder that behavior, and then to feel justified in treating and medicating someone who exhibits that behavior. It needs to be deeper than that. For a medical intervention that is going to have long-term effects on a child's development and mental health and sense of well-being. So I think all of us need to just think a little bit about how easily and how quickly one can receive a diagnosis, be put on drug intervention, and then how much time it takes to reverse the effects of those interventions. And not only the interventions, reverse the effects of those conversations that have negatively impacted your child's self-concept and their self-perception because of an observer-related bias. And observer-related biases are very specific in that you and I can look at the same scene and see very different things. And none of the things we see and don't see are wrong. but it doesn't mean that what we see and don't see are right. So when we think about an intervention and actions that are put in place based on what we can see, we need to recognize that our biases are going to influence the actions and interventions that we take. And if the costs of those biases are too high, when we talk about the quality of life of another human being, then they're always too high, then we need to be more conservative about what we take on and what we agree to. The thing about observer relative biases is there's no objective criterion. So when someone says disruptive based on what? Help me understand your definition of disruptive. Help me understand your definition of restlessness. Help me understand the definition that you are using when you're using these specific words, because we all use words with our own sort of idea of how they translate. But when you're using a word that describes a behavior where the outcome is going to be medication, then you want to ensure that there's an objective criterion that frames that specific word in a way where you can agree that that behavior shows up that specific way as well, and with that degree of frequency, with that degree of intensity. But a lot of the times, especially when we think about ADHD, we describe a lot of different behaviors very relatively, and there is no objective criterion. There's no rubric that tells you how they are defining the specific word when used within this mental health context. And that needs to happen because too many children who are normal, who might be a deviation from the majority, but still their disposition has been constant, and who are getting misdiagnosed with mental health issues. So observer relative biases are things that we need to completely nip in the bud, and we need to also recognize whose voices we shut down. And I'm all about making sure your voice is heard and making sure that you get your voice out there. But if that voice is telling you that you need to medicate your otherwise healthy child because your child makes it hard for someone to do their job, then that voice needs to get shut down very quickly. Specifically, when I think about ADHD, I've studied ADHD quite extensively, and I do always, in every video, have a link to my thesis down below for you to read it. And when ADHD first came out as a diagnosis, it was called the hyperkinetic reaction of childhood, and it was 8 lines. The last 32 years, it's grown to about 8 pages, and it's very, very subject to interpretation. And there's no aspect of the way that ADHD has translated that isn't subject to bias, subject to evaluators' bias. And remember, children don't have a voice. They don't have the ability to communicate and defend themselves against an adult who is proficient, who is eloquent, and who is a professional. So when you see that there is this neuropsychological profile disorder such as ADHD that is strictly only defined based on subjective criterion, that is very relative, and then no one is framing that relativity so that everyone can be in accordance. It's if this is what you mean when you say restless, then I agree based on the description that you've provided here. None of those specificities have been provided. And a lot of the times when you see that level of growth within a diagnostic statistic manual, it's socially, politically informed, right? The more people you can place in that bucket, the more people are, now available for different drug interventions that are in the market, that are looking to make lifelong clients out of children who are very young. And this is a very evil practice, but this is a very prevalent practice. And a lot of pharmaceutical companies are looking to target children and then find a way to create drug dependencies within a pool, a suite of drugs that they're going to need to manage the effects of that very first drug well into, retirement if they live that long, which is a bit of a morbid thought, but a real thought, and one we should all have. The fact that pharmaceutical companies get to play within the arena of the diagnostic statistic manual, the fact that they have allowed additions and revisions to take place within the DSM that provide that flexibility to offer different drug interventions that are otherwise inappropriate, that will permanently disrupt the chemical balance in a child's developing brain, that will create the need for ongoing drug interventions well into late adulthood, and severely and permanently impact a human being's quality of life. All starting within the classroom setting is problematic, and it's where the reform needs to begin. Think about ADHD. ADHD has actually 3 categories. There's ADHD, ADHD-HI, ADHD-I, DC. And I will talk about each one of these, but then when we think about the similarities and the disparities, they're very sort of homogeneous, and it's almost like, well, let's create these three different categories. We can broaden the bucket of drug intervention, and of course this is my perspective on it, but I think once we all go deeper into the details, into the research and into the refuting research, because that's never what we see. We always have access to the free research, which is provided by the pharmaceutical companies, to kind of alleviate our conscience that everything is going okay. But I think with ADHD specifically, and with the use and the prevalence and then sort of the normalizing of taking drugs like Adderall to kind of increase focus, and to, taking drugs to feel as though you can cope and manage through a day in life, are attitudes that we need to question, that we need to push back on, and that we need to fight against, because these are attitudes that really create room to be complacent with a drug-induced lifestyle, with a lifestyle that is based on drug dependency, and that is fundamentally a life that has been permanently compromised by way of your quality of life. If your quality of life, if your sense of anything is based on your capacity to take specific drugs, then I think that is a signal that society has failed in many different ways. So the first point of contention will be definitely the observer relative biases, and I think we need to all be much more attuned to when someone makes a point and when someone makes an argument that can't be refuted objectively. It's very much personal, as a personal point of view. I mean, you can see it, but you can also see things very different ways. And if there's no way to objectify that information and to make it so that everyone who sees it can see it the same way, then we need to really be very mindful about the decisions that we make in accordance with that choice. So this was a very passionate talk. I think it might even be a little bit of a rant, and if it was a bit of a rant, I apologize. But now I think now that I'm ready to get into my main issue with mental health, which is the way that it has translated within the educational spheres, I think I need to be passionate about it, because there are too many people who are managing a lot of mental health concerns, and they're being mismanaged by the mental health professionals, by the educational institutions, and by administration. And I think that maybe we're all at a loss. I think it's gotten to such an extent, and it's become a bit of a cyclone of different players that we don't quite know where to begin. So I'm happy to take a stab at beginning here, at having this discussion, that putting all the facts sort of in front of you, and then you decide what you want to do with those facts within your own life, within your own network, with your own children, with yourself even. And you decide like what changes that you're going to implement with yourself, because I think we can start with like how we live our lives individually. And then the more we iterate, the more we share, the more we are in a better position to decide how that should impact society as a whole. So that was this discussion. Thank you so much for joining me. I know definitely very passionate anytime we talk about education, but I guess that means that like this is truly a topic that is very close to my heart, and I love to talk about it. And I want to engage with other people on it, because there's no point of being passionate about something but then kind of like to yourself in a corner. Like I really definitely want to see and to meet other people who are equally passionate about this topic, so that we can turn that passion into action. We can try to create changes within the educational sphere, even if that means creating distance between education and mental health, because mental health has become a point of contention within our educational environments. Teachers being able to call mental health as a flag, and identify children as having mental health issues, and being put in a position of authority to say, well, a child can't come into my class until you medicate them and sedate them. I think that these practices need to absolutely stop. And they are huge. There are gross, I think, abuses of power as well that are in place, especially with the rates of misdiagnosis. But obviously this is a conversation I can talk about forever, but we don't have forever. We only have a limited amount of time, especially if I want you to watch the majority of this video. So thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate having these conversations with you. I'm so appreciative that like the audience that watches my education videos are growing. And even if they weren't growing, even if I was only reaching one person, I promise I would still have these conversations because they're that important to me. But in any case, if you're still here, definitely please do subscribe, like, comment, share this video, and thank you again for tuning in to another week on education. Until next time.